Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the Perspectives in FTD Research webinar series, Clinical Trials and Beyond, What Do I Need to Know About Types of FTD Research? This webinar is being presented jointly by the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration and the FTD Disorders Registry. My name is Lakeisha Vincent, and I am the Registry Manager at the FTD Disorders Registry. On behalf of everyone here, thank you for joining us. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Please note that our audience will be muted for the duration of the presentation portion. This helps to keep the background noise to a minimum so that everyone can hear the presenter clearly. If you have any technical issues, please write a message in the questions box and we will try to address them with you. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. If you have a question for one of our presenters, type it into the questions box when you think of it. You do not need to wait until the end of the presentation to submit your question. We will answer as many of them as time permits. Additionally, this webinar will be recorded and archived for later viewing on both the AFTD's YouTube page and the FTD Registry's YouTube page. I'd like to take a moment to ask you all a question. Would you consider taking part in FTD research in the future? You can respond by choosing the option that best matches your feelings. I will give everyone a couple of seconds to make their selection. Okay, here are the results. I'm sorry, here it is. 38% said definitely, 42% said maybe, 10% said no, and 10% said already participated. Okay, so now I would like to introduce our presenters. Dr. Elizabeth Finger is an associate professor for neurology at Western University. She received her MD from Cornell University and completed an internship in internal medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital, followed by residency in neurology at Massachusetts General Hospital and Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. Dr. Finger completed a clinical research fellowship at the National Institute of Health in the Unit of Affective and Cognitive Disorder at the National Institute of Mental Health. Her clinic and research programs are focused on frontotemporal degeneration, social cognition, and treatment. Dr. Shana Dodge is AFTD's Director of Research and Engagement. A licensed clinical psychologist, she holds a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Hawaii, an MA in psychology from the New School, and a BA in psychology from George Washington University. Shana has research and clinical experience in cognitive therapy and remediation, early detection of psychiatric conditions and serious mental illness. Finally, we have a special guest today. Ron has participated in FTD clinical trials and has graciously allowed us to ask him questions about his experiences. Welcome to you all. I'm going to turn the webinar over to Shana to present a brief introduction of FTD research.
Thank you, Lakeisha. When we talk about research, it's important to understand how research differs from your normal medical care. I'm not going to go through all of these bullet points, but I just wanted to highlight that research and medical care participation are different. While there are a lot of similarities, the key difference is that medical treatment is intended to benefit and help you while using accepted and approved procedures and products, whereas clinical research is intended to learn about a potential intervention to potentially help patients in the future. I wanted to start out by addressing why we conduct FTD research at all. As many of you know, there's a great unmet medical need for people with FTD and their families. There's currently no FDA-approved symptomatic treatment or a cure for FTD. Research is important to discover and test potential therapies, and those therapies could include medication, supports such as occupational, speech and talk therapies, diet and exercise, and other interventions. Unfortunately, there are now more opportunities now than ever for all kinds of people to participate in advancing the science of FTD. So that's why we need to conduct research, but why do people actually choose to volunteer as research participants? Here's some of the reasons why people in our network have told us. One thing people have said is that by participating in research, they've actually learned more about their condition or the condition of their loved one. They believe that participating in research can have the potential to help future generations or other people impacted by FTD. It allows them to take what they feel is a more active role in their care and can even give them access to interventions, specialists, and assessments that may not be available during their routine medical treatment. It helps everyone further our scientific understanding of FTD. Importantly, a lot of research is helping us figure out more accurate ways of diagnosing FTD, which many people may be aware is very difficult at this time. It can take several years to get an accurate diagnosis. And ultimately, people hope that by participating in research, we'll be able to develop potential treatments for FTD. It's important to keep in mind when we talk about research that participating in research doesn't mean just one thing. All research studies are different. They differ in who is eligible to participate. For some studies, you might need a specific diagnosis or need to be a certain age, for example. Different studies may go on for a different length of time or require a different number of visits to a medical clinic. Studies differ in their location. Some studies, for example, allow you to participate from home. Other studies require you to travel to a site location. Studies differ in the tests or procedures that might be a part of that study. Some studies just observe how people go about their everyday. Other studies involve some sort of intervention or even a placebo. Studies differ in whether participating in a study may impact your eligibility to participate in future studies. And studies differ in terms of whether they'll be able to give you individual research assessment results or even the study results themselves once the study is complete. However, all types of studies that involve human beings are mandated to protect those participants. In 1979, the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, I know that's quite a mouthful, but they published what's called the Belmont Report, which provides the foundation for regulations for the protection of research participants. And the Belmont Report includes 3 basic principles. The first is respect for persons, meaning that research participants should be treated as individuals whose opinions and choices are valued, and people with impaired decision-making ability should have extra protections. Beneficence means that human research must be designed and carried out to minimize harms to participants and maximize benefits, whether those are benefits for the participants themselves or for science or society. And justice, which means that people, including research participants, must be treated fairly with a fair sharing of burdens and benefits of research. So what the Belmont Report means for us is that safety and privacy are priorities for all research. Keep in mind that research participation is always voluntary. Participant consent or someone's agreement to participate in a study can be withdrawn or canceled at any time. And safety and privacy are protected in a number of different ways. One of the ways participants are protected is through the informed consent process. In this process, participants or potential participants are provided with all relevant information about a study to make sure they fully understand the information that was provided to them. This helps ensure that they're able to make a voluntary decision about whether or not to participate. The informed consent form includes details about the study, such as the purpose, how long the study will last, what procedures will be included, contact information for site staff, as well as potential risks and benefits of participating. And again, this is not a binding contract. Participants do have to sign the contract before any research can begin, but they can withdraw their consent at any time. Institutional review boards, or IRBs, are another way that research participants are protected. IRBs are independent boards that come together as a group to review all research involving human beings before the research study begins. The IRBs include professionals, as well as at least one member who is not affiliated with the institution conducting the research, and at least one member who is not a scientist who can represent community perspectives. And primarily, the IRB is concerned with protecting the welfare, rights, and privacy of participants. The IRB has the authority to approve a study, disapprove a study, monitor the study over time, and require changes in research activities. Studies that involve greater than minimal risk, which means a higher probability of harm or discomfort that you might encounter in everyday life, also require what's called a data and safety monitoring plan. A data and safety monitoring plan is meant to assure that each study has a system for appropriate oversight and monitoring of the conduct of researchers. The purpose of the plan is to ensure the safety of the participants, the validity of the data, and the integrity of the study. And the data safety monitoring plan will also lay out reasons why a study might be terminated early if the intervention is showing benefit, too much risk, or if it appears that the study cannot be concluded successfully. Depending on the type of study, some studies require additional independent data monitoring as well. Luckily, as I mentioned before, the last few years have really seen a huge increase in the number of opportunities for everyone to contribute to advancing the scientific understanding of FTD. That includes people diagnosed with all types of FTD, past and current care partners of people with FTD, biological family members of people with FTD and related conditions, as well as healthy individuals. And we'll learn more about some of these opportunities throughout the webinar. Thank you so much, and I will give the floor back to Lakeisha.
Thank you, Shana. Before we turn things over to Dr. Finger, I'd like to take a moment to talk about the registry. FTD Disorder Registry is a powerful tool that brings together the FTD community and assists in making strides to discover treatments and finding a cure for FTD. If you or a loved one is directly impacted by FTD, I encourage you to join the registry and share your story. The registry is open to those who are FTD diagnosed, care partners, family members, and friends. When joining the registry, there are two ways you can be active in our database. You can decide to register as a contact participant. Contact registrants will provide information that allows them to receive informational updates via our quarterly newsletters. You may also register as a research participant, which give you access to share your story by completing 3 registry surveys. Completing our surveys is one way we help our participants get involved in research. We ask specific questions about you and your loved ones, which is designed to get more information about your lived experiences with FTD. The results are de-identified and shared with professionals to relay what is important to you in research, which can be used to show the true impact of FTD and increase access to research studies and clinical trials. Please refer back to the webinar from March 2022, Amplifying the Voice of the FTD Community, Why Am I Asked So Many Questions? This will give you more in-depth information about the purposes of research questions. The webinar can be accessed via the AFTD and Registry YouTube channels. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Finger.
Great, thank you, Lakeisha. Just going to get my slides up here. Okay, thank you everyone very much for your attention and interest in this topic. And seems you can see my slides. If you can't, if one of the organizers can just let me know. These are my disclosures. I have had some paid consulting work with some of the biotech companies that are designing clinical trials for FTD, though I'll say I never would or do receive any personal remuneration based on the patients that I enroll. So I try to be very objective and hope I succeed in advising patients about studies and whether or not it's right for them. Also may touch on a clinical trial that is funded by CIHR, which is like the National Institutes of Health, but in Canada for symptomatic treatment for FTD. So my objectives today are twofold. I'll discuss the different types of clinical research opportunities that you may come across for patients or family members or care partners related to FTD, and then also talk about further considerations when you're considering participating in a clinical trial, building on what Shana discussed. Types of clinical research. So the first and perhaps most ubiquitous type of research right now in FTD or historically have been observational studies. And like the name suggests, these are studies where researchers observe different aspects about the illness and about the patient's course. This might be through detailed histories, obtaining detailed symptom information from patients. It may be through cognitive examinations, neurologic evaluations, brain imaging studies, or blood testing or spinal fluid testing, looking for different molecules or proteins that might signal different things about the disease onset and progression. These are observational because there is no intervention that's attempting to change the course of the illness. These studies are very important, in particular for helping us to get better at diagnosing FTD earlier and more accurately, as Shana highlighted, is still a need in the field. There are longitudinal observational studies, which are indeed observational studies in any of those forms, but that look for how different measures change over time. So in sub-observational studies, you may only have one participation visit, but in longitudinal studies, you may have a visit every 6 months or every year or every 2 years, or one visit at a baseline and a second visit in time. These are important, of course, for modeling how the disease progresses, how different aspects of it might change with time. And these studies have been critical to helping make the best design of clinical trials so that we can most efficiently determine whether a treatment is working early or not. There are 2 very large longitudinal observational studies happening across the US and Canada and Europe right now, the All-FTD study and the GENFI study, and other similar studies across other countries worldwide. The other main type of research are clinical trials, and clinical trials, as I think most will understand, are research studies where the participant is assigned to some kind of intervention that's hoping to change or modify some aspect of the disease. An intervention is very often a medication, but it doesn't have to be. It can be a device or a certain kind of behavioral program or supportive program. Randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials are some that you may hear about, and I'd like to highlight these because they're considered the gold standard of clinical trial designs. And by gold standard, meaning typically the design that best enables us to determine whether a treatment or an intervention actually works or not. In that long title, randomized indicates that participants are randomly assigned to one or more of the treatment groups. That could be a medication or a placebo group. It could be different doses of a medication group with a placebo. It could be assigned to a standard of care versus an intervention. The placebo-controlled is a little more obvious and indicates that some participants in the study will receive a placebo. And this is a critical control group because for most clinical trials, if we don't have a group that is very well matched, both in time and in features, to the group getting the new treatment or intervention, then it's very hard to disentangle whether that treatment is working. All of us are liable to have what's called the placebo effect, that if we are being observed more frequently, if we're getting an intervention that might help, we will actually improve to some degree. And so although a placebo group means that some people might not get that experimental treatment right away, it's critical to let us know whether treatments or interventions are effective. The double blind in this title refers to the fact that neither the local investigating team, typically including the treating clinician and researchers, as well as the patient or their family, neither will know which treatment group the patient or participant has been randomized to, typically until after the study has ended. And that's also to guard against bias, as it's well recognized that if I think I'm getting a treatment, I'm more likely to feel better and I'm more likely to rate that I feel better. And the same is true for a treating physician. If they know the patient's on the active intervention, even subconsciously, they're likely to rate them as doing better than if they're completely unaware of which intervention they're receiving. While randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trials are the gold standard, certainly there are many other kinds of designs that are used in clinical trials, and other designs do have special roles and some advantages as well. So that doesn't mean that they're inferior trials, it just may mean that the intervention being tested is at a bit of a different stage, and so an alternate design might be useful. As one example, often very early on when a treatment is first being looked at, especially if it's a treatment that's already available for a different condition, investigators will often use an open label design, and that is where everyone knows what treatment they're receiving. And that's a good way to quickly get some preliminary idea of whether there's any chance of benefit or not. If in an open label design you see no benefit, then you don't need to pursue that with more formal and lengthy studies. In an open label study, if you did see a benefit, then you still might be susceptible to it being the placebo effect, that expectation I'm going to improve because I'm on a new drug. And so then you would want to follow it up with a design that included more controlled groups. Clinical trials also come in a few different flavors with respect to what they're aiming to do with the intervention. And two categories that are somewhat distinct, although they can overlap as well, are symptomatic interventions and disease-modifying interventions. Symptomatic interventions are those where specific symptoms of a disease are targeted, and that's what the intervention is thought to improve. So perhaps in FTD, a symptomatic intervention might target agitation or apathy or disinhibition. In contrast, disease-modifying interventions are targeting aspects of the disease, typically at the molecular level, at the level of what's happening in the brain cells, to try to slow or stop the progression of the disease and to try and delay the onset, or in the ideal world, of course, prevent the onset. Now, some disease-modifying treatments might also help with symptoms, and some treatments that were thought to be symptomatic interventions might actually have some disease-modifying properties. But by and large, these are two somewhat distinct categories, and it's a good idea when you're thinking about participating to know what the target of the intervention is. These are some examples of current or expected upcoming trials targeting different symptoms in FTD. I know there's a lot of information on this slide, but I just did want to give you an idea that these are increasingly exciting times for research and clinical trials in FTD, where we're having the largest numbers I think we ever have of ideas and studies, allowing us hopefully to get better evidence for improving the quality of life for patients and caregivers by getting better control of these symptoms. Some of these treatments, as you can see, are medications. Some are non-pharmacologic interventions around web-based supports, and some are using devices such as transcranial magnetic stimulation, which uses a magnetic field to alter the firing properties of the brain cells. As Shana mentioned, and as probably most people on the webinar know, unfortunately, still today, 2022, we don't yet have medications that have been proven to be disease modifying for FTD. So none that can accomplish any of the critical goals on this slide to slow, stop, or reverse the disease. However, just as it's increasingly exciting times for symptomatic trials in FTD, the same is true, perhaps for the first time in our history, for disease-modifying trials coming to frontotemporal degeneration. There are several trials ongoing now and more anticipated in the next few years. And these trials largely reflect several different kind of scientific breakthroughs that have happened outside of FTD, but hold a lot of promise for FTD treatment. I've listed some of the most common here. The small molecules are perhaps what's most familiar to us. These are medications that can typically be given in pill form, and through their action and binding of different things in the cells may alter the function and hopefully change the course. There are antisense oligonucleotides, which are a mirror image of genetic material that tries to bind to genetic mutations that cause FTD and block those mutated genes from causing their harmful properties. Viral vectors have been looked at in other diseases and are now being explored in FTD. These are common viruses that would typically be relatively benign or perhaps cause the common cold, but a beneficial gene has been attached to them. The virus is typically injected once into the central nervous system, and the idea is that the brain cells take up that virus, and in doing so, take up the good copy of the gene, and that good copy of the gene can then hopefully produce the necessary molecular protein to counteract the genetic mutation that the patient may harbor. And finally, very common in Alzheimer's disease clinical trials and also being used now in some trials for FTD are intravenous infusions, typically once a month, of antibodies that have been specifically synthesized to target a certain molecule. And by targeting that molecule, it is hoping to affect the cascade of changes that lead to frontotemporal degeneration. So what happens in a clinical trial? Many of you on the webinar have participated before. For those who haven't, Shana highlighted this, but initially, whether it's on the phone or ultimately in person, a member of the research team would give you information in writing about the study and would also discuss typically with you face-to-face or on the phone the nature of the study, the risks, etc. If you were interested and it was thought that you were likely eligible for the study, after signing the consent form, you would be scheduled for a screening visit. And here the research team would typically have different questions and questionnaires they would complete with you. There may be a blood draw, there may be brain imaging, there may be tests around the heart, around strength. In some studies, a lumbar puncture to assess the spinal fluid, which gives us a good idea of what's happening in the brain cells as well. Each study will be different depending on the nature of the intervention and may have one or more of these types of screening assessments. The screening visit is done to determine for sure whether or not a participant is eligible for the study, making sure that they're not at any increased risk of participating in the study, and that they meet criteria for what the study and intervention are targeting. After that, if it were a randomized controlled trial, then the participant would be randomized to one of the different intervention or treatment groups. And then they would have their follow-up visits. And this can vary a lot depending on the nature of the intervention. In some studies, the visits might be once a month. In others, it might be once a year or once every 6 months. So that's an important question as well when you're thinking about whether a certain trial is a possibility for you. At the interval visits, often a subset of measures completed at the screening visit are repeated to help see how these change over time in both the intervention group and the placebo group. At the end of the pre-specified study duration, which maybe on average is most commonly 1 year or sometimes 2 years, but could really be quite variable. There would be at the end an open label extension for many studies. So after completing the first phase of a randomized study where some participants received placebo and some people received the experimental intervention, if the study intervention has appeared safe at that point, then often all participants are invited to receive the active intervention, whether or not they receive the placebo or the active treatment in the first year of the study. This is a way that participants in some ways can have their altruism and their volunteering in the trial recognized and appreciated, so they have earlier access to this intervention before it necessarily is approved by the FDA or Health Canada. And it also enables the investigators to collect additional data to see whether the treatment is safe and effective over longer periods of time. The open label extension for studies is optional. Eventually, the study will stop, including the open label extension. And that typically happens if the study intervention is found to be effective, then the sponsors, the company or investigators would seek regulatory approval from the FDA or Health Canada. And once it was approved, then it could be prescribed to patients. Or the open label extension might be halted or stopped under one of two conditions. First, if it's found not to be safe, it would be stopped right away. And second would be if it's safe, but they then analyze the data and find out it's not effective. That information would be shared with all the participants and the open label extension would be stopped. Another aspect to think about when reviewing clinical trials and trying to decide if one is for you or for your family member is the phase of the clinical trial. So most medications proceed through a pretty standard way to determine ultimately whether they're effective and safe in human patients. In the very first stage on the left, the preclinical phase with the test tube, studies are done in petri dish cell cultures and ultimately in other animal models, whether it's mice, rats, non-human primates, or others, to establish whether the medication or the intervention seems to be reaching its target and whether it appears to be safe, not only for the brain, but for all the cells of the body and the organism. If positive signals are seen in the preclinical studies, then the drug may advance to the earliest clinical trials in humans, and these are called phase 1 studies. Phase 1 studies are typically very small to start, and they often feature healthy adult participants, not necessarily patients, who often in an open label design will receive the experimental intervention. These are typically very short. Often there's just a single dose of the medication to start, while lots of measurements are done of heart function, kidney function, liver function, and brain function. Phase 1 also determines what dose is safe. So sometimes there will be increasing doses until the one that the investigators think is most effective is reached, or the one that appears to be at the limit of safety. Once a drug appears to be safe at a particular dose or dose range in a phase 1 study, then it may advance to a phase 2 study. In phase 2 studies, additional participants or larger numbers of participants are enrolled, though they're still relatively small. These participants usually are patients at this point. And in phase 2, further aspects of understanding the nature of the intervention, what it might help to treat, and sometimes dose schedules or dose ranges are explored. Many drugs will fail at phase 2 because there will no longer be any preliminary signal of efficacy or benefit, at which point they may not be developed further. For those treatments, though, that still do show some promising effects in phase 2 studies and that appear safe, may advance to phase 3 trials. And phase 3 trials are the final step before a drug would be submitted for regulatory review to be approved. So phase 3 trials are larger. The number of participants will depend on the nature of the intervention and on the condition being studied, but typically are larger. This is where that gold standard randomized double-blind placebo control is usually very important. And at the end of the phase 3 study, we do expect to know whether the drug is safe and whether it is effective across a broad range of people of different ages, different backgrounds, etc. If a drug does look effective coming out of the phase 3, then the FDA in Canada, Health Canada would review it. And if they decide that it looks effective and is safe, they may approve it, at which point physicians can prescribe that medication. At that point, there still is some research happening in a phase 4 study where participants who receive the medication may still have some data collected to further typically track safety measures to make sure as more patients, perhaps with other more serious comorbid diseases, take the medication, that there aren't any unexpected safety concerns. With that background, where can you find out information on clinical trials for FTD? At www.clinicaltrials.gov, there are some search bars. You can put in FTD or any other disorder that you're interested in, and you can search for trials that are actively recruiting. They'll give you quite a bit of information about the inclusion and exclusion criteria, what the drug is, and also sites where that trial is running with contact numbers that you can call or email. And finally, you've gone to clinicaltrials.gov, you found a few studies, you've connected either through your physician who's referred you or through contacting the investigators from clinicaltrials.gov directly. You found a study or two that you think you might be interested in. When you're looking at those informed consent documents or talking to the research team or your physician, what are the questions you should ask to see if it's right for you? First, what is the goal of the treatment? Is it targeting a symptom? And if so, which symptom or symptom complex? Is it disease modifying? And if so, is the goal to prevent FTD, to delay the onset, to slow the progression, or some other nuanced goal? Is there a placebo arm so that you know whether you are for sure going to receive the active intervention or if you might be randomized to one or the other? And some studies, to try and reduce the number of patients that receive the placebo, will have different ratios. So they may have, for every 2 patients that are randomized to the active intervention, they may have 1 randomized to placebo. So you can find out what the ratio is and therefore what the odds are that you'll receive one or the other. What is involved in the study visits? Of course, testing, blood draws. Some, as I mentioned, do feature lumbar punctures and whether that's something you're willing to undergo. The frequency of the treatment and the study visits. What phase the study is will give you an idea of how much is known about it so far and what the goals of that particular phase are going to hopefully address. Any expected side effects of the study medication. So a medication may still be considered safe coming out of the preclinical studies, the phase 1 or phase 2, and have some side effects as long as those are thought to be not too serious relative to the potential benefit. So the informed consent documents will describe all of those for you in detail, and that's a question you can also ask the investigators. The duration of the trial, of course. And you might want to know whether there is an open label phase planned at the end, or if it's a phase 2 study, whether there'll be a continuation for participants in phase 2 if the trial goes into phase 3. And then I think a really important question that wasn't so relevant for FTD before when we really had very few trials to offer, but is increasingly relevant now is, I found this one trial. Are there any other trials for me to consider? And to really go back to your physician, your neurologist, your NP. And I think it is very important you ask them that question directly, because there will be subtle differences perhaps if you have an opportunity to participate in more than one clinical trial, and they can help you identify which is the one that would best meet your goals. So my last slide, I promise. I really like this quote that is available on the NIH information page listed there on clinical trials, that they offer hope for many people and a chance to help researchers find better treatments for others in the future. And Shana had highlighted that. And I say that because, although we know FTD progresses pretty relentlessly without any intervention, we don't know whether any one of these clinical trials is going to make a difference for the patients enrolled at that time. And I don't want patients to go in, with too high of expectations that a clinical trial is going to save them from FTD, because certainly it may not. But I think if the goal of the participants in research is to help people in the future, then whether you get placebo or active intervention, whether that intervention works or not, you have absolutely helped to advance the field and gotten us towards a better future for the next generation that much more quickly. So with that, I thank everyone for their attention, and I think we will go over now to the Q&A with Ron, who's graciously joined us to share his experience.
Hello.
Hello, welcome Ron, and thanks again for joining us. So I know you through our site, but maybe we'll just start out to introduce yourself, Ron, however you would like to the group here today.
Okay, I'm Ron. I am asymptomatic FTD. I'm in 2 studies right now, an observational study and in a clinical trial with once a month drug infusion. I retired about 1.5 years ago, and everything's good, and clinical trials are going great.
Wonderful, thanks, Ron. And I think, from what you've just said, we were thrilled that you could join us because you have a really rich experience with clinical trials in FTD and a lot of great insights. Maybe I'll ask you, if you don't mind, why did you choose to participate in the studies that you did, or that you are?
Well, it has a strong history in my family. My father had FTD. My sister passed away of FTD, and I currently have a brother who's on his last legs. And I've seen the effects of it. Plus, the last 12 years of my employment, I worked in long-term care. So I was around it all the time. So I seen what happens. So it was a no-brainer.
Great, thank you. Do you recall how you found out about the research opportunities?
Yes. When my brother was diagnosed, his wife, my sister-in-law, apparently had given the information to you about our family, and then we were invited, and myself and 2 other siblings came down to join in, and we were all tested, and we joined the observational study.
Wonderful, thanks. And I'll just mention there, for those in the audience who may not be close to a center with FTD research or expertise, the FTD Registry that Lakeisha highlighted is a wonderful way to register and therefore get on the mailing list, so you're made aware of research opportunities across the US and Canada, and also to check out the clinicaltrials.gov. Ron, could you tell us what has been involved in your participation in the research studies?
In the research study, the observational part is I had to go through a lot of testing. It was basically put the round peg in the square hole and that kind of stuff. Lots of brain teasers. I did enjoy all that stuff. There was a lot of repeating back stories, things like that, numbers. trying to remember words, and it's not easy actually.
Great, yeah. And, you know, I think that's exactly right. I know you did really well, but I think some participants worry, oh, I missed one, something's wrong, and that's not the case. They're hard, you know, on purpose for everybody. In the clinical trials, can you describe a bit of what you've gone through, what kinds of assessments for that?
Yes, lots of blood work. I've had lumbar punctures. I've had brain imaging. And of course, the EKGs, everything that was listed on your trials, on your speech. We've been through it all, because there's currently myself and one other sibling who is in the same clinical trial as I am. Yeah, once every 4 weeks, we have our drug infusion, and then we are in phase 2 right now. And so things have gotten stretched out a little bit more. We don't have to have the lumbar puncture anymore. We only have the MRI for the brain, I think, once a year now. And it's live a normal life.
Mm-hmm. Great. And I recall you participated in the phase 1 study originally as well, and then went on to do the phase 2. What, if anything, has surprised you about participating in research? Was different than what you might have expected?
Nothing. It's been so professional. I did expect that, and it is professional. I like the protection of my any dignity, my privacy. It's everything. It's number one. Nothing surprised me.
Okay, great. And I know, you know, I'll say Ron has been a very well-informed participant, you know, keeping me on my toes as he reads information from very credible sites out there. So that's been a mutual benefit. Maybe I'll ask you, if it wasn't surprising to you, how was your experience with the lumbar punctures for somebody that hasn't had a lumbar puncture and maybe on the fence as to whether they want to consider that?
Lumbar puncture is very harmless. The only part you feel is the freezing going in. It's just like getting a tooth frozen, and you feel that going into your back, but you don't feel anything else. It's very easy, and I had a good person doing it too.
And since he's not here, maybe I don't know if your brother's experience was any different, you know, in the car ride home, if he had any other sentiments about the lumbar puncture, although I know you both have had a few.
Absolutely not. He said no problems whatsoever.
Okay.
Perfect.
Great. And from your perspective, what questions are important for participants to ask when considering participating in a study?
Well, what I was thinking of, and you actually covered it, and it's, can I opt out at any time? Also, I guess you want to know how much information you're going to be given through it, how much, so that you can, are you being kept up to date on everything? I realize some stuff you cannot be told. It has to be part of the study, and it's protected. But it'd be nice to know probably if the drug is approved, if you continue getting the drug, things like that.
Yeah, those are great points, Ron. Thank you. And, you know, I think I can say for pretty much any study, you can always opt out. You don't have to even give a reason. That's certainly the right of a research participant to stop participating. You may be asked if you're willing, you know, some questions or to come in one last time for final assessments, but you may choose that you're not willing to do that. And that, you know, again, is the participant's right. That's a great point about knowing what information you'll get back, right? Because certainly there are some things we all really want to know, but that information may not even come to your site or your physician in the study or the team at all. It may only be kept centrally so that everyone stays blinded, you know, to what changes may or may not be happening until the end of the study. So that's a great point, because I think we'd all like all the information, but you don't necessarily get it while the study is in progress. Wonderful. Now, Ron, is there anything else that you want to mention today?
I think we've covered it all, Dr. Finger.
Okay, Great. I'll turn it back over to Lakeisha and Shana, and I think we both may have some questions in the Q&A if you'll stay with us.
Thank you, Ron and Dr. Finger, and thank you, Shana, who is also rejoining us as we take questions from the audience. Please use the question box to enter your questions, and we will answer as many as we have time to do so. Okay, first question. I've tried to apply for studies and have been told no. How is it determined who is eligible?
I can take that one maybe to start. So it is an issue. Most research studies, whether it's an FTD or otherwise, have very strict inclusion and exclusion criteria, which means you have to have certain features or blood levels or MRI findings, and you can't have other conditions or possibly stages of disease. The inclusion exclusion criteria are different for every study. It just depends what the intervention is targeting. But your site investigators and your site physicians don't have any wiggle room. So if you don't meet those inclusion exclusion criteria, based on the ethics approvals, they cannot just slip you into the study. Those are really written in stone. And it's to try and make sure that the people enrolling in the study can really, benefit from the treatment and that it would likely be safe for them. So that can be frustrating, I know, but that may be the reason. Other times it may be, if the diagnosis is not established enough, and every study has, again, different criteria. They may be looking at patients with possible FTD who don't necessarily have MRI changes, whereas other studies may need very obvious MRI changes for eligibility. But it's certainly reasonable to ask, the people screening you, why didn't I meet the criteria for this study, so that you know.
Okay, thank you. Next question. If I joined the FTD registry, how do you keep my information private? And I guess that one's for me. So we have basically 3 ways that we help to protect privacy. We have a HIPAA compliant database. That means the goal of that is to make sure that no personal information is shared with anyone. It's kind of like what you basically see when you're in your doctor's office and you're sharing information in those different portals. We kind of use that same criteria to make sure we're keeping your information private. We also use a global unique identifier, which is a GUID, that is a alphanumeric number, and we take out all your personal information and use that information in place of it. And that way, no one can be able to tell when you're sharing information via the registration process. Also, when you are answering survey questions. We also make sure that we use de-identified data when we share information on our publications, when we're sharing on our websites and things of that nature. It's all de-identified. No one can tell who you are. Okay, next question. Can you enroll in more than one study or trial at the same time?
That's a good question. I can start with that, and Shana may have another answer too. Sometimes, but not always. So some observational studies will let you enroll in multiple studies at once if they're not going to interfere. Often the concern there is if you're in 2 different studies that both have cognitive testing. If you've just heard the story you're supposed to remember last week in one study, and now you're going to the next study a week later, your performance is going to be skewed, because you've seen that material more often. So there's some checks that need to be done if you're going to participate in more than one observational study, just to make sure they're not interfering with each other. The clinical trials are a little more stringent. So very often, if you are in a clinical trial with an intervention, they will not permit you to participate actively in other research studies for the duration of that clinical trial for that same concern around interference or overburdening participants. In one example, though, say in the GENFI study, and I think this is true for all FTDs, you might be in that observational study, longitudinal study. If you go into a clinical trial, your participation in the GENFI or all FTDs is just paused, but you're still a part of that study. And then when your clinical trial finishes, if you like to, you can resume with the observational study visits.
I think Dr. Finger, you got that. You really covered that well. And I think it's probably a good question to ask when you were speaking earlier and Ron were speaking about the kinds of questions to ask when you're considering enrolling in the study. And one you may want to consider is whether you can participate in other studies at the same time, or if you're already participating in a study, if that impacts your eligibility.
Okay, next question. I read that one study is using intracisterna magna, I'm sorry if I said that wrong, administration. Is that safe?
Yeah, so intracisterna magna infusion or injection basically is a little needle injection just below the base of the skull to enter into the space where the cerebrospinal fluid is, because that fluid is continuous and coats the spinal cord and brain. And so it is a way to pretty directly get something very close and ideally into the brain. Some of the viral vector interventions that I mentioned very briefly are using that cisterna magna injection approach right now, because essentially they have one injection of the virus and that's it. You don't need any other injections the rest of your life in theory or ideally, but they really want to make sure it gets to the brain. In terms of safety, I can't speak to specific numbers. Our site isn't doing those yet, though other sites around the world are. But certainly that would have had rigorous review from the ethics boards. And although, you know, it's somewhat invasive, when done by properly trained, usually anesthesiologists or neurosurgeons, it would be considered very safe.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Finger. That's all the time we have. Thank you, Elizabeth, Ron, and Shana for being with us today. Before we go, I would like to revisit the question we asked you earlier. Would you consider taking part in FTD research in the future? Again, I will give everyone a couple of seconds to make their selection. And here are the results. 46% said definitely, 34% said maybe, 6% said no, and 14% said already participated. Again, thanks everyone who joined the webinar today. We hope you found this presentation to be informative. As a reminder, this webinar is recorded. You will also be able to find it on both the AFTD and the FTD Disorders Registry's website and YouTube channels in the coming days. If you have further questions about FTD, you can contact the AFTD helpline at 866-507-7222 or by emailing info@theaftd.org. And be sure to sign up for the FTD Disorders Registry if you haven't already. Please visit ftdregistry.org to learn more. Thank you.